What happens when a single father's kind gesture breaks through the walls of a woman who's forgotten what it means to be vulnerable? Ethan Carter never imagined that one rainy night would change everything, not just for him, but for his boss, Madeleine Stone, the woman everyone feared but no one truly knew. Behind her cold exterior was a heart starving for connection, and in his gentle touch she found something she thought she'd lost forever, the courage to feel again. But when desire awakens and walls come crumbling down, can two wounded souls build something real? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and become a member for early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the Super Thanks button too. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you. The office lights had already gone out on nearly every floor when Ethan Carter finally shut down his computer. The blue glow from the screen left a ghostly imprint on his retina as he blinked, adjusting to the dim hallway. His fingers automatically reached for his pocket, searching for his car keys with the urgency of someone who has someone waiting at home. And he did. Lily, his daughter. His reason for waking up every day at 5:30 in the morning and racing against the clock until nightfall. The elevator descended slowly, and Ethan took those few seconds of silence to rub his face with both hands. His stubble scratched against his palms, reminding him there was no time for personal grooming when you're both father and mother at once. The elevator mirror reflected a tired man, but not a defeated one. There was something in his eyes, a quiet determination, a flame that refused to go out. Stepping out of the building, the cold night wind greeted him with a cutting embrace. Ethan pulled his jacket zipper up to his neck and quickened his pace toward the parking lot. His mind was already home. He pictured Lily sitting at the kitchen table, swinging her legs while waiting for dinner. She'd probably already finished her homework, always so responsible, so mature for her age. Sometimes Ethan caught himself wondering if she'd grown up too fast, if her mother's absence had forced her to become an old child before her time. But he did his best. He always had. As he drove through the city's busy streets, Ethan let his mind wander through memories he'd rather forget. The divorce, the silent fights. The day his ex-wife simply decided she didn't want that life anymore, didn't want him anymore, didn't want Lily anymore. The pain of that abandonment still throbbed somewhere deep in his chest, but he'd learned to push it down, to lock it in a dark corner where it couldn't reach him during the day. At night, though, it was different. At night, when Lily was already asleep and the house fell into absolute silence, the emptiness took shape, became tangible. Ethan would sit on the couch with a beer he rarely finished and stare at the walls as if they might give him some answer. He knew he was lonely, knew there was a part of him, an important part, that was asleep, numbed by routine and responsibilities. But there was no room to think about that now, no time for dating, for meetups, for conversations that might lead to something more. His life was Lily, and that was enough. Or at least that's what he told himself every night. Upstairs in the building where Ethan worked, in a spacious office overlooking the city, Madeleine Stone was still awake. The lamp's light cast long shadows on the walls as she leafed through documents she should have reviewed hours ago. Her eyes burned, but she didn't stop. Never stopped. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. And feeling was something Madeleine had learned to avoid with mastery. She was known around the office as the Ice Woman, the ruthless boss, the one who never smiled, never praised, never showed weakness. Employees spoke of her in whispers, speculated about her personal life with morbid curiosity, but no one dared to ask. No one got close enough to discover that behind that impeccable armor was a deeply tired woman. Madeleine stood up from her chair and walked to the window. Down below, the city glittered like a field of fallen stars. Cars passed in endless lines. People rushed to their homes, to their loves, to their lives full of meaning. And her? She stayed there alone at the top of a building that felt more like a prison than a throne. Her fingers touched the cold glass of the window. She could feel the city's vibration through it, a distant pulse that didn't reach her. When was the last time someone had touched her with affection? When was the last time she'd felt the warmth of a hug that wasn't formal, professional, empty? Madeleine shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. Weakness. That was weakness. And she couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Not after everything she'd built. Alone. Always alone. She returned to her desk and grabbed her purse. It was past 11 at night. Even she had limits. Or should have. As she left the office, Madeline felt the weight of the empty building's silence. Her heels echoed through the hallway like the beats of a lonely heart. She entered the elevator and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. That's when she noticed her shoulders were slumped. Her eyes, though closed, felt heavier than ever. There was an exhaustion that went beyond the body, a weariness of the soul that no night's sleep could cure. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, Madeline took a deep breath and straightened her posture. Back straight, chin up, neutral expression. The mask went back in place. Always did. But something about that night was different. Maybe it was the wine she'd drunk alone in the office, trying to drown the loneliness that insisted on screaming inside her. Maybe it was the accumulated fatigue of years pretending everything was fine. Or maybe it was just the universe conspiring so that on that rainy night, two lonely souls would meet. Ethan had just arrived home when his phone buzzed. It was a message from the office security system. Last person leaving the building detected. He frowned. Madeline was still there? At that hour? A strange discomfort took hold of him. She was his boss, yes, but she was also human, and no one should be working that late. Lily was already asleep when he peeked through her bedroom door. Her brown hair was spread across the pillow, and she was holding the stuffed bear she'd gotten for her birthday. Ethan smiled, feeling his chest tighten with love and gratitude. That girl was everything. Absolutely everything. He closed the door carefully and went to the kitchen to prepare the next day's dinner. As he chopped vegetables and seasonings, his mind returned to Madeline. He watched her sometimes, from afar, without her noticing. And lately, there was something different about her. Something he couldn't name but recognized, because he carried it inside himself too. Loneliness. The knife stopped in midair. Ethan blinked, surprised by his own thought. Could she feel that way too? Could there be a woman behind that calculated coldness who just wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be held? He shook his head and went back to chopping the vegetables. It wasn't his business. Madeline Stone was a powerful, successful woman who surely had a structured personal life. She didn't need compassion from a subordinate. But as he put the food away in the fridge, Ethan couldn't help one last thought. What if she did? The rain started as a distant threat, dark clouds gathering on the horizon as the day slowly died. But when Ethan left the building that night, the storm had already taken over the city with unexpected fury. Thick drops hammered the asphalt, creating a chaotic symphony that echoed between the empty buildings of the corporate district. He ran to his car, feeling the cold water soak his hair and trickle down his neck. The jacket he wore was inadequate for that downpour, but there was no time to complain. Lily was with the neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, who kindly watched her on nights when Ethan needed to work late. He was already running behind, and guilt was starting to gnaw at his stomach. That's when he saw her. Madeline Stone was standing at the building entrance, under the small awning that barely offered protection against the wind-driven rain. She was holding her phone with both hands, and even from a distance, Ethan could tell something was wrong. Her movements were uncoordinated, imprecise. She was tapping the screen repeatedly, but her fingers seemed not to obey her brain's commands. Ethan stopped in the middle of the parking lot, the rain now completely soaking his clothes. His instinct screamed for him to keep going, get in the car, go home to take care of Lily. But there was something about Madeline's posture, in her slumped shoulders, in the way she leaned slightly against the wall as if needing support, that made him hesitate. She was vulnerable. And vulnerability wasn't a word that fit with Madeline Stone. Before he could think twice, Ethan changed direction and walked toward her. The water pooled on the ground, splashed with each step, and when he finally reached the awning, he was completely drenched. Madeline looked up, and that's when he saw it. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. Her dilated pupils reflected the yellowish light from the nearby street lamp, and there was an unnatural flush on her pale cheeks. Her perfume, normally subtle and elegant, was mixed with the unmistakable smell of wine. A lot of wine. Ms. Stone? Ethan's voice came out softer than he intended, almost a whisper amid the storm's noise. She blinked, as if trying to focus on him through a thick fog. Ethan. Her voice dragged slightly, each syllable carrying a weight that shouldn't be there. What are you still doing here? Was going to ask you the same thing. He took a step forward, watching her carefully. Is everything okay? Madeline gave a short, bitter laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Okay? Of course. Everything's always okay. She looked back at her phone, tapping the screen with growing frustration. This damn app won't work. Or maybe it's the phone. Or maybe it's me. Ethan realized she was trying to call a car. Her fingers slid across the screen without coordination, closing and opening the app repeatedly without success. He could see the frustration building on her face, the mask of control beginning to crack. I can take you home. The words came out before he could fully process them. It's safe. I just want to help. Madeline looked up again, this time with an expression that mixed surprise and something that looked like fear, distrust. It was hard to tell through that alcoholic haze that seemed to envelop her. You don't need to do that, she murmured, but there was a fragility in her voice that contradicted the words. I can manage on my own. I always have. I know you can. Ethan kept his voice calm, warm, like he did when Lily had nightmares and needed to be soothed. But today you don't have to. Let me help, please. There was a moment of silence. The rain kept falling, relentless, and the wind carried the damp smell of the washed city. Madeline looked at him, really looked, and Ethan felt something move inside his chest. There was so much pain in those eyes, so much loneliness hidden behind professional coldness. She opened her mouth to respond, but that's when it happened. Her knees gave out. It was subtle, just a slight loss of balance, but enough to make her stumble to the side. Ethan reacted on instinct, stepping forward and catching her by the waist before she could fall. His hands found the curve of her body, firm beneath the damp fabric of her dress, and for one endless moment, the world seemed to stop. Madeline leaned into him, her hands finding Ethan's chest to steady herself. She was so close now that he could feel the warmth of her body, could see every detail of her face. Her eyelashes wet from the rain, the way her lips were parted in surprise, the rapid pulse visible at her throat. Sorry, she whispered, but didn't pull away. I didn't mean to. It's okay. Ethan's voice came out hoarse, deeper than normal. He could smell her perfume mixed with wine and rain, an intoxicating combination that made his head spin. I've got you. Their faces were inches apart. Ethan could feel her warm breath touching his skin, could see the way she looked at his lips before quickly looking away, as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. There was electricity in the air, not just from the storm, but something more visceral, more dangerous. A tension that pulsed between them like a wire stretched to its limit. Madeline blinked, and something in her seemed to break. Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hold back, but one escaped, sliding down her cheek and getting lost among the raindrops. I'm so tired, she confessed, her voice breaking. So tired of pretending everything's fine, of being strong all the time, of always being always alone. Ethan felt his heart tighten, his fingers still firm on her waist, squeezed gently, offering silent comfort. You don't have to pretend with me, he said softly. Not tonight. She closed her eyes and more tears fell. Ethan pulled her closer, shielding her from the rain with his own body. They stayed like that for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Two strangers who weren't really strangers, two lonely souls finding comfort in each other in the middle of a storm. Come on, Ethan finally said, his voice firm but gentle. I'll take you home. This time Madeline didn't protest. She just nodded, letting him guide her to the car. Ethan opened the back door and helped her in, making sure she was comfortable before gently closing the door. As he walked around the car to the driver's seat, he could feel his heart racing, could feel the ghost of her touch still burning on his hands. Something had changed in that empty parking lot, something he couldn't name but knew, with a frightening certainty, would never be the same again. The car's engine hummed low as Ethan adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes quickly finding Madeline's reflection in the back seat. She had settled into the corner, her head slightly tilted against the window glass, her half-closed eyes watching the city lights transform into colorful blurs through the rain. Ethan turned on the heater, and warm air began circulating through the car's interior, bringing with it her scent, a mixture of white flowers, red wine, and something indefinable that was purely Madeline. He held his breath for a moment, trying to ignore the effect that smell had on him. "What's your address?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral, professional. There was a pause. Madeline took a few seconds to respond, as if she needed to gather strength to form the words. When she finally spoke, her voice came out low, almost a murmur. "Monarch Building, 847 Aspen Street." Ethan knew the place. One of the most exclusive addresses in the city, where each apartment cost more than he'd earn in a lifetime. Of course she lived there, it made sense. Everything about Madeline Stone screamed success, power, control. Except now. Now she was vulnerable, stripped of all the armor that normally protected her from the world. And there was something deeply intimate about that, something that made Ethan feel as if he was being allowed into a secret sanctuary where few had access. He guided the car through the wet streets, the windshield wipers working at a steady rhythm that created a kind of hypnotic melody. The city was quieter now, most people already tucked away in their homes, safe and protected from the storm. Only a few cars passed in the opposite direction, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives of light. "Do you have children?" Madeline's question cut through the silence so unexpectedly that Ethan almost hit the brakes. He looked in the rearview mirror and met her eyes fixed on him. Even through the alcoholic haze, there was genuine curiosity there, a desire to know him that went beyond the professional relationship they maintained. "I do," he answered, feeling an involuntary smile form on his lips. "A daughter. Lily." "Lily," Madeline repeated, savoring the name. "That's a beautiful name. Delicate." "She's delicate, but she's also strong." Ethan made a smooth turn, his fingers gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. Talking about Lily always stirred something in him in a way nothing else could. Stronger than me sometimes. Madeline was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again there was a melancholy in her voice that made Ethan's chest tighten. "You're lucky. To have someone. To not be completely alone." Ethan felt the words like a punch to the gut. He looked in the rearview mirror again and saw that she had closed her eyes, but a single tear slid down her cheek, reflecting the intermittent light from the passing street lamps. "You're not alone," he said softly, without thinking about the implications of the words. Madeline opened her eyes slowly, and this time, when she looked at him through the mirror, there was a vulnerability so raw, so exposed, that Ethan felt as if he was seeing her naked soul. "I am," she whispered. "I always have been. Even when there were people around me, I was alone. It's like living inside a glass dome. You can see everyone out there, can hear them vaguely, but you can never really touch them, never feel their warmth." The rain was beating harder now, creating a constant drumming on the car's roof. Ethan slowed down, not because he needed to, but because something inside him wanted to prolong that moment, that conversation. There was a sincerity in her he'd never seen before, a brutal honesty that only drunkenness and extreme exhaustion could bring to the surface. "I know what that's like," he admitted, surprising himself with his own honesty. "That loneliness, even surrounded by people, even having responsibilities, there are moments when you feel empty, like there's a hole inside you that nothing can fill." Madeline leaned forward, her arms resting on the back of the driver's seat, her face now closer to his. Ethan could feel the warmth of her breath, could see the reflection of her eyes in the side mirror. "Everyone thinks I'm strong," she continued, her voice choked. "They think I don't need anyone, that I'm self-sufficient, immune, invincible. But the truth is," she stopped, swallowing hard. "The truth is that sometimes I just wish someone would tell me I'm safe, that it's okay not to be strong all the time, that I can just be." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and true. Ethan felt something move inside his chest, a deep tenderness, an almost desperate desire to comfort her, to protect her, to make her know she didn't have to carry the world alone. He stopped at a red light, and for the first time since they'd started the trip, turned completely to look at her. Their eyes met without the barrier of the mirror, and the intensity of that gaze made the air inside the car feel denser, more charged. "You're safe," Ethan said, each word loaded with a conviction he barely knew he possessed. "Tonight, here, now, you're safe." Madeline caught her breath, her lips parting slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Instead, She reached out and touched his shoulder. A light touch, hesitant, but one that burned through the fabric of his shirt like fire. The light turned green, but for a moment, neither of them moved. They just stayed there, connected by that simple touch that carried the weight of all unspoken words, all repressed desires, all the loneliness accumulated over years of pretending everything was fine. When Ethan finally started driving again, his skin still tingled where she had touched him. Madeleine leaned back again but stayed tilted forward, as if she didn't want to lose the closeness they'd created. "Thank you," she whispered after a few minutes, so quietly he almost didn't hear it over the rain. "For not judging me, for not treating me like the ice boss everyone thinks I am." "You're not made of ice," Ethan replied, his eyes meeting hers once more through the rearview mirror. "You're just protected. There's a difference." A sad smile formed on her lips, small, fleeting, but genuine. "Maybe. Or maybe I've been behind these walls so long I forgot what it's like to be on the outside. Then maybe it's time to remember." The words came out before Ethan could censor them, loaded with an implicit promise that made both their hearts race. Madeleine didn't respond, but the way she looked at him, with those eyes full of hope and fear mixed together, said everything. They were only a few blocks from her apartment now. Ethan could see the Monarch building in the distance, its lights shining against the dark sky. Part of him wanted to speed up, get there quickly, put an end to this night charged with tension and dangerous possibilities. But another part, a bigger, more honest part, wanted this drive to never end. Because he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that when this night was over, when Madeleine went back to being the untouchable boss and he went back to being the discreet employee, this moment of true connection might be lost forever. And that, he realized with a tightening in his chest, would be more painful than any loneliness he'd ever felt. The Monarch building rose imposing against the night sky, its lit windows creating a mosaic of other people's lives. Ethan parked in front of the main entrance, where a uniformed doorman watched them with discreet curiosity from behind the glass. The rain had lessened to a fine drizzle, but the air was still heavy with moisture and electricity. He turned off the engine and stayed there for a moment, hearing only Madeleine's soft breathing in the back seat and the ping-ping of drops hitting the hood. When he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw she was motionless, eyes closed, her expression relaxed in a way he'd never seen before. "Madeleine?" he called softly. "We're here." She took a few seconds to respond, as if emerging from a deep sleep. When she opened her eyes, there was momentary disorientation there, followed by a slow awareness of where she was and who she was with. "Already?" she murmured, straightening up in the seat. She ran her hand through her hair in a gesture that revealed nervousness. Thank you for bringing me." Ethan got out of the car and walked around to the back door, opening it for her. Madeleine accepted the hand he offered, her cold fingers intertwining with his as she got out with difficulty. When she stood up, she swayed slightly, and Ethan held her by the waist again, feeling the same electrical charge as the first time he'd touched her in the office parking lot. "Can you walk?" he asked, keeping his arm around her. "I think so," Madeleine answered, but her voice didn't sound convincing. She took a step and almost stumbled in her own heels. Or maybe not. Without hesitation, Ethan held her more firmly, practically supporting all her weight against his body. They walked like that to the building entrance, their steps synchronized in an awkward but strangely intimate dance. The doorman opened the door for them, his face carefully neutral, though Ethan could feel the silent judgment in his eyes. "Good evening, Ms. Stone," the man said with a polite bow. Madeleine just waved vaguely, all her concentration focused on putting one foot in front of the other. In the elevator, she leaned against the mirrored wall, and Ethan took the opportunity to study her more closely. Even disheveled, even visibly drunk, there was a beauty about her that took his breath away. It wasn't just physical, though she was undeniably gorgeous, but something deeper, something that came from within. "What floor?" he asked. "Penthouse," she answered, searching for something in her purse with trembling fingers. After a few seconds of fruitless searching, she found a magnetic card and handed it to him. "You need this to access it." Ethan swiped the card and pressed the penthouse button. The elevator rose smoothly, and the silence between them was different now, heavier, more aware. Each passing second brought them closer to her apartment, to the moment when he'd have to say goodbye and return to his life, leaving this strange and unexpected night behind. But he didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not when she was like this, so vulnerable, so in need of someone to take care of her. The elevator doors opened directly into the apartment's private foyer. Madeline searched for her keys in her purse, her movements increasingly uncoordinated. Ethan watched as she tried to insert the key in the lock, missing repeatedly, frustration growing on her face. "Let me help," he offered, gently taking the keys from her hand. He unlocked the door and opened it, revealing an interior that took his breath away. The apartment was immense, with double-height ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city. The design was minimalist, almost Spartan, everything in shades of white, grey and black. Expensive but cold furniture, modern art on the walls that seemed more like obligatory decoration than personal choice. But what struck Ethan most was the emptiness. There were no photographs, no personal mementos, no sign that anyone actually lived there. It was as if the apartment was just a set, a stage where Madeline played the role of a successful woman, but never really inhabited that space. Madeline stumbled in, kicking off her heels with a sigh of relief. She walked to the enormous white leather sofa, the only piece of furniture that seemed to have been actually used, and let herself fall onto it without ceremony. Ethan closed the door behind him and stood in the foyer, unsure whether he should enter or say goodbye right there. But when he saw Madeline curled up in the corner of the sofa, arms around her own body as if trying to warm herself, something inside him broke. He went in. "I'll get you some water," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. The kitchen was immaculate, everything in its place, but Ethan noticed the refrigerator was almost empty, just a few bottles of white wine, expired yogurt, and leftovers that were probably delivery from days ago. He filled a glass with filtered water and returned to the living room. Madeline was in the same position, eyes closed, breathing irregular. Ethan knelt beside the sofa, extending the glass to her. "Drink," he instructed gently. "It'll help." She opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression so lost, so helpless, that Ethan felt a physical pain in his chest. Madeline took the glass with trembling hands and drank small sips, as if even that required monumental effort. When she finished, Ethan took the glass back and placed it on the coffee table. He knew he should leave now, should let her rest, go home, to Lily, to his normal and safe life. But his feet seemed glued to the floor. "So you should rest," he finally said, looking for something to cover her with. He found a cashmere throw folded on a nearby armchair, probably just decorative, never used, and brought it to the sofa. Madeline had already lain down, curled in the fetal position, and there was something so lonely about that image that Ethan had to swallow the lump that formed in his throat. He covered her carefully, adjusting the throw to make sure she was warm. As he did, his fingers accidentally brushed her face, and Madeline leaned into the touch like a flower seeking the sun. "Ethan," she murmured, eyes still closed, voice thick with sleep and emotion. "Don't go. Not yet." He froze, his hand still in the air near her face. "You need to sleep." "I know." She opened her eyes, and the tears she'd held back all night finally began to fall. "But I don't want to be alone. Not tonight. Please." Ethan felt his heart shatter. He knew that staying would cross an invisible line, that it would change the dynamic between them in a way they might not be able to undo. But looking at her now, so fragile, so human, so different from the impenetrable woman everyone knew, he couldn't say no. "Okay," he whispered, sitting on the floor beside the sofa. "I'll stay until you fall asleep." A faint smile formed on Madeline's lips, and she reached out her hand, her fingers finding his and intertwining with surprising strength. "Thank you," she said so quietly he almost didn't hear it, "for seeing me, for not running away when you saw who I really am." Ethan squeezed her hand back, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her skin. "Who you really are is beautiful, Madeline. Don't be afraid of that." She closed her eyes again, but this time there was peace in her expression. Her breathing gradually slowed, becoming deep and regular. Within minutes she was asleep, but still holding Ethan's hand firmly, as if even unconscious she feared he would leave. Ethan stayed there, watching her sleep. Even in sleep, there was a crease of worry between her eyebrows, a residual tension that not even dreams could completely dissolve. He raised his free hand and with infinite gentleness smoothed that crease with his thumb. Madeline murmured something unintelligible and nestled deeper into the throw. Ethan smiled sadly, knowing that when the sun rose, when sobriety returned, this vulnerable and true version of Madeline would probably hide again behind the walls that protected her from the world. But for tonight, in this moment, she was just a tired woman who needed to know she wasn't alone, and he was just a man who, against all logic and reason, wanted to be the one to show her that. Ethan waited until he was sure she was deeply asleep. Then, careful not to wake her, he gently released her hand and stood up. He picked up a notepad he saw on the coffee table and wrote in his clear handwriting, "You're safe. Rest. Ethan." He left the note where she could see it when she woke up, grabbed his car keys and walked silently to the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. Madeline slept serenely now, the throw rising and falling with her breathing. And in that moment, Ethan knew, with a certainty that both frightened and moved him in equal measure, that something had changed irrevocably between them. The door closed with a soft click, and he left, carrying the image of her engraved in his heart. Sunlight invaded Ethan's office through the poorly closed blinds, creating golden stripes across the desk, full of papers and reports he'd been pretending to review for at least an hour. His mind was elsewhere, or rather, with someone else. Since leaving Madeline's apartment the night before, he couldn't stop thinking about her, about the vulnerability she'd shown, the touch of her hands, the way she'd whispered his name before falling asleep. Ethan ran his hand over his face, trying to focus on the numbers in front of him, but the columns seemed to dance on the page without making any sense. He'd slept poorly, waking several times during the early morning, always with the same question hammering in his head. Would she remember everything? Would she regret having opened up that way? Worse yet, would she pretend nothing had happened? The idea bothered him more than it should. After all, Madeline was his boss. What had happened the night before had just been a moment of weakness on her part. An atypical situation that couldn't mean anything beyond a gesture of humanity on his part. But then why did his heart race every time he heard footsteps in the hallway? Why was he obsessively looking at the phone, waiting for what exactly? The clock read 11:20 in the morning when the phone finally rang. Ethan looked at the device as if it were a snake about to strike. The caller ID showed only X001, the executive office. Madeline's office. He held his breath and answered, forcing his voice to sound casual. Ethan Carter. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then that voice, the voice that had echoed in his dreams all night, filled his ear. Ethan. The way she said his name was different, soft, almost shy. Come to my office. We need to talk. Before he could respond, the line went dead. Ethan placed the phone in the cradle with slightly trembling hands. We need to talk. The four most feared words in any human relationship, professional or otherwise. His stomach tightened into a knot as he stood up, smoothing his shirt and checking his tie in the reflection of the computer screen. The hallway to the executive floor had never seemed so long. Each step echoed on the polished marble, and Ethan could feel the curious glances from some colleagues as he passed. Did they know? Had anyone seen them leaving together the night before? When he reached the door to Madeline's office, he hesitated, his hand suspended inches from the dark wood. On the other side, he could hear silence. No sound of typing, no phone conversations. Just silence. He took a deep breath and knocked. Come in. Her voice came through the door, and Ethan turned the handle. What he saw took his breath away. Madeline was standing in front of the window, exactly as he'd imagined her. But everything about her was different from the rigid and controlled woman he knew. Her hair, normally pulled back in an impeccable bun, was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore a dress he'd never seen her wear before. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was less corporate, less armor. The fluid navy fabric hugged her curves in a way that made Ethan's mouth go dry. When she turned to face him, Ethan saw that her makeup was also different, lighter, more natural, as if she'd decided to stop hiding who she really was. Close the door, Madeline said, and there was something in her voice that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He obeyed, the click of the lock echoing in the silent office like a gunshot. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the space that separated them, a physical distance of a few meters that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Madeline was the first to break the silence. She took a step toward him, and then another, the sound of her heels against the wooden floor marking the rhythm of something inevitable. "I remember everything," she said, stopping at a distance that was too close to be professional, but still far enough to be safe. "The rain, the car, what I said, what you did." Ethan swallowed hard. "Madeline, No." She raised her hand, interrupting him. "Let me speak first, please." He nodded, unable to find words anyway. Madeline took a deep breath, and Ethan could see the internal struggle happening behind those eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was loaded with a raw emotion he recognized from the night before. "I've spent my whole life building walls," she began, her eyes fixed on his. "Walls so high and so thick that even I couldn't see what was on the other side anymore. I thought that's how you survived in this world. That's how you earned respect, power, success." She paused, and Ethan saw her hands close into fists at her sides, as if she were fighting to maintain control. But last night, Madeline took another step toward him, and now they were so close that Ethan could smell her perfume, different from the night before, without the wine, just flowers and something slightly citrusy. "Last night, you saw me, the real me, the person who stays hidden behind all these walls, and you didn't run, didn't judge me, didn't take advantage of my weakness." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "You weren't weak, Madeline. You were being human." A sad smile touched her lips. "It's funny how those two things seem like synonyms to me." She shook her head. "You treated me with a kindness I haven't received in, I can't even say how long. Made me feel safe. And that feeling," her voice failed, and she had to pause to regain her composure. "That feeling was so rare, so precious, that I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop thinking about you." Ethan's heart was beating so hard, he was certain she could hear it. He wanted to say something, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. Madeline took the last step that separated them. Now they were inches from each other, and Ethan could see every detail of her face, the way her eyes shone with held-back tears, how her lips trembled slightly, how a vein pulsed gently in her neck. "I called you here because—" She stopped, closing her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. When she opened them again, there was a determination there that Ethan recognized. "Because I don't want to pretend yesterday didn't happen. I don't want to go back to being that cold woman who keeps everyone at a distance. Not with you." Ethan felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. "What are you saying?" Madeline slowly raised her hand, giving him time to pull away if he wanted. But he didn't pull away. He couldn't, even if he wanted to. She touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and Ethan closed his eyes for an instant, allowing himself to feel that touch. "I'm saying that you saw me yesterday," she whispered, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear. "Saw me at my worst moment, vulnerable and broken, and still you treated me as if I were precious, as if I mattered beyond the position I hold, beyond the facade I project." Ethan opened his eyes and found hers so close he could see the golden flecks mixed with the brown of her irises. "You matter," he said, his own voice hoarse. "Much more than you imagine." A trembling sigh escaped Madeline's lips, and she tilted her head slightly, her eyes falling to his mouth before returning to his eyes. "Ethan," she whispered, and there was a question in that name, a silent request for permission, for confirmation that he felt the same as she did. He responded the only way he knew how. He raised his hand and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing the warm skin of her neck. Madeline closed her eyes at the touch, leaning into him, as she had the night before. "You're looking at me again," she murmured, eyes still closed. "The way you looked yesterday, as if I were different." "Because you are," Ethan replied, his fingers now tracing the curve of her cheek. "You're extraordinary, Madeline, and I'd love to show you that if you'll let me." Madeline opened her eyes slowly, and what Ethan saw there took his breath away. There was desire, yes, a spark of something deep and powerful that he felt echoing in his own body, but there was also fear. Fear of being hurt, of opening up and discovering she'd been wrong. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed, her voice breaking slightly. I don't know how to let someone in. I don't know if I'll be good at it." Ethan smiled, and it was a genuine warm smile that lit up his entire face. "Nobody knows, Madeline. We figure it out together." She caught her breath, and for a moment, Ethan thought she would pull back, that fear would win. But then, something changed in her expression, a surrender, a silent decision to take a leap of faith. "Together," she repeated, savoring the word as if it was something new and strange. Then, with a vulnerability that broke and rebuilt Ethan's heart at the same time, she asked, "Do you want to have dinner with me tonight? Not as boss and employee, as us?" Ethan felt a smile form on his lips. "There's nothing I want more." The relief that crossed Madeline's face was palpable. She smiled back, a real smile, luminous, so different from the polite and measured smile she used at work. And there, in that office where so many business decisions had been made, a much more important decision was sealed. Not with contracts or handshakes, but with looks that promised possibilities, with touches that whispered promises, and with two hearts tired of being alone that finally found the courage to try again. The day dragged on with torturous slowness. Ethan tried to focus on work, but every task seemed insignificant compared to the dinner waiting for him at the end of the day. He reviewed the same report 3 times without absorbing a single word, his thoughts constantly returning to that moment in Madeline's office, the way she'd looked at him, the touch of her fingers on his face, the implicit promise in that invitation. When the clock finally struck 6, Ethan left the office with his heart racing. Madeline had sent a simple message during the afternoon. "My apartment, 7 o'clock, I want to cook for you." The idea of Madeline Stone cooking was so incongruous with the image he had of her that it almost made him smile. But there was something deeply intimate about that gesture. She wasn't taking him to an expensive restaurant where they could hide behind menus and attentive waiters. She was inviting him into her personal space, into her real life. Ethan stopped quickly at home, took a quick shower and changed clothes. Lily was with Mrs. Martinez again. He'd made up an excuse about a last-minute meeting, feeling guilty about the half-truth. But as he looked at himself in the mirror, adjusting the light blue shirt that Lily always said made his eyes shine, he knew this was important, too important to ignore. When he arrived at the Monarch building, the same doorman from the night before greeted him with a discreet nod. This time, Ethan wasn't carrying a drunk and vulnerable woman. This time, he was there by choice, his and hers. The elevator rose quickly, and when the doors opened in the private foyer, Ethan saw that the apartment door was ajar. He pushed it gently and entered, immediately enveloped by a wonderful smell of garlic, herbs, and something baking in the oven. "Madeline," he called, "in the kitchen." Her voice came cheerfully, so different from the formal tone she used at the office that Ethan had to stop for a moment to process it. He followed the smell and the voice, and what he found made him stop at the kitchen doorway, simply watching. Madeline had her back to him, stirring something in a pot on the stove. She'd changed out of the elegant dress into jeans, and a simple white cotton blouse. Her feet were bare, and her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. There was an apron tied around her waist, and she was humming softly while cooking. It was the most domestic, most normal, most absolutely beautiful scene Ethan had ever seen. "Are you going to just stand there or help me?" Madeline asked without turning around, and there was a playful note in her voice that warmed Ethan's heart. "How did you know I was here?" he asked, approaching. "I felt you." She finally turned around, and the smile on her face was so genuine, so unguarded, that Ethan had to fight the urge to pull her into his arms, right there. "Plus you have heavy footsteps," Ethan laughed. "Heavy footsteps?" "Like someone who carries the world on their shoulders," she said, and there was an understanding in her eyes that suggested she knew exactly what that felt like. He approached the stove, looking at the pots. "What are you making?" "Trying to cook." Madeline made an adorable grimace. Emphasis on trying. "I haven't done this in so long I forgot half the steps. I hope you like slightly burned pasta." "I love slightly burned pasta," Ethan said with fake seriousness, and was rewarded with a laugh, a real musical laugh that echoed through the kitchen and seemed to light up the entire space. They worked together in comfortable silence, their bodies moving around each other with surprising ease. Ethan chopped vegetables while Madeline finished the sauce, Occasionally their arms touched, their hips bumped, and each casual contact sent small waves of electricity through both of them. "Why did you decide to cook?" Ethan asked after a while, his curiosity winning out. Madeline stopped stirring the sauce and looked at him. There was a vulnerability in her expression that he was beginning to recognize, that openness she only allowed when she let her defenses down. "Because I wanted to do something personal," she admitted. "I wanted you to see this part of me, the part that isn't the CEO, isn't the ruthless boss, just Madeline." Ethan put the knife aside and turned completely to her. "I want to know all the parts of you, Madeline, not just the one you show the world." She caught her breath, her eyes searching his, as if looking for signs of lies or manipulation. But all she found was raw sincerity. "Then you need to know," she said slowly, "that I'm not good at this, at opening up, at trusting. I've spent so much time protecting myself that I don't know how to let someone in anymore without being afraid of being destroyed." Ethan took a step toward her, and then another, until they were inches apart. He raised his hand and touched her face gently, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "I'm scared too," he confessed. "Scared of opening up and finding out I'm not enough. Scared that when you really know me, the overwhelmed single father who can barely keep it all together, you'll realize you made a mistake." Madeline closed her eyes at his touch, leaning into his palm. When she opened them again, they were shining with unshed tears. "You saw me at my worst moment," she whispered. "Drunk, crying, completely broken. And you didn't run. You stayed. You took care of me. You made me feel valuable. Because you are." Ethan used his other hand to brush away a strand of hair that had escaped from the ponytail. "You're incredible, Madeline, and any fear I have is worth it if it means having the chance to be here, with you, like this." A tear finally escaped, sliding down her cheek. Ethan wiped it away with his thumb, and Madeline let out a trembling sigh that seemed to carry years of loneliness and repressed pain. "Last night," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "when you put me on the couch and stayed there holding my hand, it was the first time in years I felt safe, truly safe. Like for a moment, I could stop fighting, stop proving my worth, and just be." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He gently pulled her closer, and Madeline came without resistance, her arms wrapping around his waist as she rested her head on his chest. "You don't need to prove anything to me," he murmured against her hair. "I already see you, the real you, and she's more than enough." Madeline trembled in his arms, and Ethan held her tighter, offering the silent comfort of his presence. They stayed like that for long minutes, just holding each other, breathing together, allowing the intimacy of the moment to envelop them like a warm blanket. When Madeline finally pulled away, her eyes were red, but clearer than Ethan had ever seen them. There was something different about her now. A lightness, as if a weight she'd carried for years had been partially lifted. "The pasta's going to burn," she said with a small smile, wiping her eyes. "Let it burn," Ethan replied, but she was already turning to the stove, turning off the burners and checking the oven. They finished preparing dinner together, and this time conversation flowed easily. Madeline told him about how she learned to cook with her grandmother as a child before life got complicated, and cooking became just another task on the endless list of responsibilities. Ethan shared stories about Lily, about the challenges of raising a child alone, about the small victories that made it all worthwhile. When they finally sat down to eat at the small balcony table, which Ethan suspected had never been used before, the city glittered below them like a sea of stars. The pasta was perfectly cooked. The wine Madeline chose was excellent, but none of that mattered as much as the way they looked at each other across the table. "Thank you," Madeline said suddenly, putting her fork aside. "For what? For yesterday? For today? For this?" She gestured vaguely between them. "For not giving up on me before even really knowing me." Ethan reached his hand across the table, and she took it without hesitation. Their fingers intertwined, and he could feel her racing pulse against his skin. "Madeline," he said, his voice serious, "I don't know where this is going. I don't know how we're going to navigate the office dynamic, or how I'm going to explain this to Lily, or what the future holds, but I know one thing for sure." "What?" she whispered. "That you're worth any complication, any challenge, any risk." He squeezed her hand. "And I want to try. Really try. If you want to, too." Madeline didn't respond with words. Instead, she stood up, walked around the table, and stood beside him. Ethan looked at her questioningly, and she simply extended her hand. He took it, standing up, and Madeline guided him away from the table to the center of the balcony where the soft light from the candles she'd lit danced on the walls. "I do," she finally said, turning to face him. "I want to try, even though it scares me, even though I don't know how." Ethan smiled, gently pulling her closer until their bodies were touching, until he could feel the warmth of her against him. "Then let's figure it out together," he murmured, echoing the words he'd said earlier. And then, under the stars and candlelight, with the city silently witnessing below, something definitively changed between them. It was no longer just attraction or shared loneliness. It was a conscious choice to open up, to take a risk, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find in each other what they'd both been searching for so long. The candlelight flickered softly, casting dancing shadows on the balcony walls. The wine in their glasses was forgotten, slowly cooling while Ethan and Madeline remained there, standing in the center of that intimate space, their bodies so close they could feel each other's warmth through their clothes. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, dense with possibilities, unspoken promises, a desire that had been contained for so long it now threatened to overflow at any moment. Ethan could hear Madeline's breathing, slightly accelerated, could see the way her eyes moved from his eyes to his lips and back, as if she were fighting an internal battle between what she wanted and what she thought she should do. "Madeline," he whispered, his voice hoarse. It wasn't a question, but it sounded like one anyway. She raised her eyes to meet his, and what Ethan saw there took his breath away. There was vulnerability, yes, but there was also something deeper, a longing, a need that echoed his own. She wanted this as much as he did, maybe even more. Slowly, giving her all the time in the world to pull away if she wanted, Ethan raised his hand and touched her face. His fingers traced the delicate line of her jaw, rising until they reached a strand of hair that had escaped from the ponytail. He gently wrapped it around his finger, feeling the silky texture, before carefully tucking it behind her ear. The touch was simple, almost innocent, but the way Madeline reacted, closing her eyes, leaning into his hand, letting out a sigh so soft he almost didn't hear it, ignited something inside Ethan's chest. When she opened her eyes again, there were tears there, but not of sadness. It was something else, relief perhaps, or recognition, as if she'd finally found something she'd been searching for her whole life, without knowing she was looking for it. "You're looking at me again," she whispered, echoing the words she'd said earlier in the day. "Like I'm different from everyone else you know." Ethan let his fingers slide from her hair to the curve of her neck, feeling the racing pulse beneath the soft skin. "Because you are," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're unique, Madeline. Extraordinary. And I'd love to spend the rest of the night showing you how special you are." A tremor ran through her body, and Ethan felt her lean even closer to him, eliminating the last few inches separating them. Their bodies now touched completely, chest against chest, hips aligned, legs intertwining. Madeline raised her hands slowly, hesitant, as if she still didn't quite believe she had permission to touch him. But when her palms finally landed on his chest, Ethan felt the burn of the touch through the fabric of his shirt. Her fingers spread, exploring, feeling the tense muscles beneath her hands, the racing heart that betrayed exactly how affected he was too. "Ethan," she breathed. And there was so much in that name, desire, fear, hope, surrender. He couldn't wait any longer. With one hand still caressing her neck and the other sliding to the curve of her waist, Ethan tilted his head slowly. He gave her all the time to pull away, to change her mind, to say no, but Madeline did none of that. Instead, she rose on her tiptoes, closing the distance between them, her eyes still fixed on his, as if wanting to memorize every detail of that moment. When their lips finally touched, it was as if the entire world had stopped spinning. The kiss started soft, a gentle exploration, almost reverent. Ethan's lips brushed hers with a delicacy that contrasted with the urgency he felt burning in his veins. Madeline made a low sound, something between a sigh and a moan, and her hands rose from his chest to his shoulders, gripping as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become fluid. Ethan deepened the kiss gradually, his hand on her waist pulling her even closer, while the other buried itself in her hair, undoing the ponytail and letting the strands fall freely over his fingers. Madeleine responded with equal intensity, her lips opening to him, inviting him for more, for everything. There was a hunger in that kiss, years of loneliness, of unmet need, of repressed desires finally finding an outlet. But there was also tenderness, care, a silent promise that this was more than just physical desire. Madeleine's hands slid from his shoulders to the nape of his neck, her fingers intertwining in Ethan's dark hair, pulling him closer, deeper. She pressed against him with an urgency that made Ethan groan against her lips, his own hands exploring the curves of her body through the thin fabric of her blouse. When they finally separated to breathe, both were gasping. Madeleine kept her eyes closed for a few more seconds, her forehead resting against his, their breaths mixing in the minimal space between their faces. "Wow," she finally whispered, and there was a touch of wonder in her voice that made Ethan smile. "Wow, indeed," he agreed, his lips brushing her forehead in a soft kiss. Madeleine opened her eyes slowly, and what Ethan saw there made his heart race. There was desire, yes, a deep and intense desire that mirrored his own. But there was also something softer, more frightening. There was feeling, something that was beginning to grow between them, something that went far beyond physical attraction. "I don't want this to end," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want you to leave and for us to go back to being just boss and employee tomorrow. I don't want to pretend this didn't mean anything." Ethan held her face with both hands, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "This meant everything," he said with an intensity that made her tremble. "And I'm not going anywhere, Madeleine, not unless you ask me to." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time she smiled, a radiant, genuine smile that completely transformed her face. And then she pulled him back, her lips meeting his with renewed passion. This time, the kiss was more urgent, more needy. Ethan's hands descended down her back, feeling the curve of her spine, the softness of her skin through the fabric. Madeleine arched against him, a low moan escaping her throat when he gently nibbled her lower lip. They moved without thinking, their bodies guiding themselves by instinct, until Madeleine's back found the balcony wall. Ethan pressed her against it, his body covering hers completely, and Madeleine wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him even closer, as if wanting to merge completely with him. His hands found the hem of her blouse, his fingers sliding underneath to touch the warm skin of her waist. Madeleine gasped at the contact, her head falling back against the wall, exposing the delicate curve of her neck. Ethan took the opportunity, his lips leaving hers to trace a burning path along her jaw, descending to the pulse throbbing in her throat. "Ethan," Madeleine gasped, her nails lightly scratching the back of his neck. "Please." He raised his head to look at her, and what he saw in her eyes, that pure and desperate desire mixed with trust and something dangerously close to love, almost brought him to his knees. "Tell me," he murmured against her lips. "Tell me what you want." Madeleine looked into his eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was firm despite the tremor running through her entire body. "I want you, all of you, tonight, now." Ethan felt something break inside him, the last remnant of resistance, of reason, of fear. All that remained was desire, need, and an overwhelming urge to give her everything she was asking for and more. "Are you sure?" he asked, because he needed to hear it, needed to know she really wanted this as much as he did. In response, Madeleine took his hand and placed it over her heart, where he could feel the racing beats against his palm. "I feel you here," she whispered. "I feel you in every beat. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." It was all Ethan needed to hear. He picked her up in one fluid motion, and Madeleine wrapped her legs around his waist, her arms firm around his neck. He carried her through the balcony, past the living room, finding his way instinctively to the bedroom he'd briefly seen the night before. With each step, they kissed, hungry, desperate kisses that spoke of years of loneliness and empty nights finally coming to an end. When Ethan finally set her down beside the bed, both were trembling not from fear but from anticipation. Madeleine looked at him with eyes that shone with desire and something deeper, more frightening. Her hands found the buttons of his shirt, and slowly, reverently, She began to unbutton them one by one. And as the night unfolded around them, full of promises and possibilities, one thing became absolutely clear. What was happening between them was more than just physical attraction. It was the beginning of something real, something precious, something they'd both waited for so long they'd almost given up believing it could exist. But it did exist, and it was happening. Now. The bedroom was wrapped in soft dimness, lit only by the city light coming through the large windows. The curtains were open, revealing the nighttime landscape that stretched infinitely, a sea of twinkling lights that seemed to reflect the stars in the sky. But neither Ethan nor Madeline paid attention to the view. All their attention was focused on each other. Madeline's hands trembled slightly as she unbuttoned the last button of Ethan's shirt. She slid the fabric off his shoulders, letting it fall to the floor forgotten, and for the first time allowed her eyes to freely explore his body. There was strength there. Not the exhibitionist strength of someone who spent hours at the gym, but the real strength of a man who worked hard, who carried responsibilities, who lived life fully. Her fingers touched his chest hesitantly, as if asking permission, and when Ethan covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his racing heart, she let out a trembling sigh. "You're nervous," Ethan observed gently, not as an accusation, but as an acknowledgement. Madeline nodded, unable to lie to him. "It's been a long time," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper, "and it was never like this. Never meant something real." Ethan felt his chest tighten hearing those words. He raised his hands and held her face with a tenderness that contrasted with the urgency still pulsing between them. "Then let's do it right," he promised, his eyes searching hers in the dimness. "With time, with care, with truth." Madeline closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were shining with unshed tears. "I don't know if I deserve you," she confessed. "You deserve everything," Ethan replied, before capturing her lips again in a deep and slow kiss that stole the air from both of them. This time, when his hands moved, it was with more confidence. Ethan found the hem of Madeline's blouse and lifted it slowly, giving her time to change her mind. But she raised her arms in silent surrender, allowing him to undress her. The fabric joined his shirt on the floor, and Ethan had to hold his breath seeing her there, standing before him in her vulnerability. She was beautiful, not in the artificial way of magazines, but in a real, human, imperfect way, and for that reason, absolutely perfect. There was a faint scar near her collarbone, marks of time that she probably tried to hide day to day, but which to Ethan only made her more real, more herself. "You're beautiful," he said, and there was so much sincerity in his voice that Madeline had to fight the urge to cover herself, to hide the insecurities she carried about her own body. "You don't have to say that," she began, but Ethan interrupted her by placing a finger on her lips. "I'm not saying it because I have to. I'm saying it because it's true." He let his fingers trace the outline of her shoulder, descending down her arm until they intertwined with hers. "Every part of you is beautiful to me." Madeline felt something break inside her. A wall, a defense, something that kept her separated from the world. And when it was gone, all that remained was herself, naked and honest and absolutely terrified, but also, for the first time in a long time, hopeful. She took a step forward, and her hands found his belt, working on the buckle with fingers that still trembled, but now more from anticipation than fear. Ethan watched her, letting her have control, allowing her to set the pace. When they were finally down to just their underwear, Madeline stopped, her eyes traveling over his body with an appreciation that made Ethan's skin tingle. Then, slowly, she extended her hand, inviting him. Ethan took it, intertwining their fingers, and guided her to the bed. But instead of rushing her, he sat on the edge and pulled her to stand between his legs, his arms wrapping around her waist, as he rested his head against her stomach. Madeline ran her fingers through his hair, feeling the texture, the softness, the way he leaned into her touch as if he were thirsting for it. "I've never done this before," she suddenly whispered, and there was a tremor in her voice that made Ethan raise his head to look at her. "What?" Madeline bit her lip, and in the dimness he could see the blush rising in her cheeks. "I've never been with someone like this. Not really. It was always functional. quick, without feeling. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and vulnerable. And then Madeline added in a whisper so low Ethan almost didn't hear, "I've never done this with someone I actually wanted." Ethan's heart seemed to stop for a moment. He stood up, his hands holding her face, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "Madeline," he said, and there was an intensity in his voice that made her tremble. "Are you telling me that I'm a virgin in what really matters?" she completed, tears finally sliding down her cheeks. Virgin in true intimacy. Virgin in real connection. Virgin in love. The last word came out broken, loaded with years of loneliness and a hope so fragile it seemed it could shatter at any moment. Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight he could feel every tremor that ran through her body. "Then let's discover this together," he murmured against her hair. "Because I'm also a virgin in this, in feeling something so deep it scares me, in wanting someone not just physically but in every way." Madeline sobbed against his chest, her arms wrapping around him as if he were the only thing keeping her anchored to earth. And maybe he was. They stayed like that for long minutes, just holding each other, allowing the vulnerability of the moment to envelop them. When Madeline finally pulled away, her eyes were red but clear, and there was a determination there that wasn't there before. "Show me," she asked, her voice firm despite the tears. "Show me what it's like when it means something." Ethan didn't need any more invitation. He laid her on the bed with a gentleness that made more tears spring to her eyes. Then, slowly, reverently, he began to explore every inch of exposed skin. His lips traced the path from her throat to her collarbone, lingering on the small scar he'd noticed before. His hands slid along the sides of her body, memorizing every curve, every contour. Madeline arched under his touch, small sounds escaping her lips, sounds of pleasure mixed with surprise, as if she didn't know her body could feel so much. "Ethan," she gasped, when his lips found sensitive spots she didn't even know existed. This is it good?" he murmured against her skin, lifting his eyes to meet hers. "It's more than good," she replied, her hands finding his shoulders, nails pressing lightly. It's everything." Ethan smiled against her skin and continued his exploration, taking his time, refusing to rush a single moment. When he finally removed the last fabric barriers between them, Madeline trembled, not from cold, but from anticipation. He paused, looking at her lying there, completely exposed, completely vulnerable, completely trusting in him. And something inside him broke and rebuilt itself at the same time. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he said. And it wasn't just about the physical. It was about the courage she showed by allowing herself to be seen, about the strength it took to let her defenses fall, about the beauty of a soul that was finally allowing itself to feel. Madeline reached her arms up to him, and when their bodies finally joined, it was with a slowness that bordered on reverence. Ethan moved carefully, watching every expression on her face, making sure each touch brought pleasure and not pain. And Madeline, for the first time in her life, allowed herself to truly feel his weight on her, the warmth of his skin, the way their hearts beat in sync. Feel the deep connection that went far beyond the physical, that touched something inside her that had been asleep for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Her hands explored his back, tracing the tense muscles, feeling the way he trembled under her touch. Her lips found his neck, savoring the taste of his skin, the sound of his accelerated breathing near her ear. And when they finally reached the peak together, it was with an intensity that left them both trembling and breathless. Madeline cried out, not in pain, but in pure ecstasy, mixed with emotional relief so deep it was almost like catharsis. Ethan held her during and after, whispering words of comfort and admiration against her hair as she trembled in his arms. And when the waves finally subsided, leaving them exhausted and intertwined, Madeline nestled deeply against his chest, listening to the comforting sound of his heart beating strong. "You're more than you imagine, Madeline," Ethan whispered, kissing the top of her head. "So much more." She just closed her eyes, allowing herself for the first time in years to feel completely safe in someone's arms. Morning light came through the large windows, bathing the bedroom in golden tones that seemed to transform everything into something ethereal, almost unreal. Ethan woke slowly, his consciousness emerging from the depths of the most peaceful sleep he'd had in years. For a moment, disoriented, he didn't recognize where he was. The ceiling was different, the bed was different, even the smell in the air was different. Then he felt the soft weight against his chest, the warmth of another body curled into his, and it all came back in a wave of memories that made his heart race. Madeline. She was asleep against him, her head resting in the curve of his shoulder, one arm thrown across his chest, legs intertwined with his. Her hair was spread across the pillow like a dark halo, and in the soft morning light, she looked even more beautiful than the night before, more real, more human, more herself. Ethan didn't move, afraid to wake her, afraid to break the magic of that moment. His fingers found her hair instinctively, caressing the silky strands with a tenderness that surprised even him. He'd never felt like this before, so protective, so connected, so absolutely certain he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But with that certainty also came fear. Fear of what this meant, of what would happen when they left this room and returned to the real world, where she was his boss and he was her subordinate, of what they'd say at the office, of how they'd navigate the inevitable complications. And Lily, how would he explain this to Lily? As if sensing his thoughts, Madeline stirred, letting out a soft sigh before slowly opening her eyes. For a moment she seemed confused, her eyes blinking in the bright light. Then her gaze met his and a small, shy smile formed on her lips, a smile so genuine, so devoid of the masks she normally wore, that it made Ethan's chest tighten. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice hoarse from sleep. "Good morning," Ethan replied, unable to contain the smile spreading across his face. Madeline propped herself up on her elbow to look at him better. The sheet slid down, revealing the bare skin of her shoulders, and Ethan had to fight the urge to pull her back into his arms and never let her go. "You stayed," she said, and there was a note of surprise in her voice, as if part of her had expected to wake up alone. "Of course I stayed," Ethan replied, reaching to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Why would I leave?" Madeline looked away, biting her lower lip. "I don't know. I just thought maybe you'd regret it. That maybe in the light of day this would all seem like a mistake." Ethan sat up immediately, pulling her with him until they were face to face, the sheet around them both. He held her face with both hands, forcing her to look into his eyes. "Listen to me, Madeline," he said with an intensity that made her catch her breath. "Last night wasn't a mistake. It was the rightest thing that's happened to me in a long time. And I don't regret a single second." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time she smiled through them. "Me neither," she admitted. "I was so afraid it would be. Afraid it was just passing desire. But waking up with you here," her voice failed, and she had to pause to regain her composure. "Waking up with you here made me realize this is real, that you're real." Ethan pulled her into a hug, and Madeline melted against him, her arms wrapping around his waist as if he were her anchor in a turbulent sea. They stayed like that for long minutes, just holding each other, allowing the reality of what they'd shared to settle over them. Then Madeline gently pulled away, looking at the clock on the nightstand. "You need to go," she said reluctantly. "Lily must be waiting for you." The mention of his daughter brought Ethan back to reality with an impact. He closed his eyes, momentary guilt crossing his chest. He'd called Mrs. Martinez the night before, saying he'd need to stay out all night for work reasons. Another half-truth that weighed on him now. "I know," he said, but didn't move to get out of bed. "Not yet. But before I go, we need to talk about what happens now." Madeline nodded, pulling the sheet up higher as if suddenly feeling exposed. "I know. At the office No," Ethan interrupted gently. "I'm not talking about the office. I'm talking about us. About what this means." Madeline looked at him, raw vulnerability written across every line of her face. "What do you want it to mean?" Ethan took a deep breath, knowing what he was about to say could change everything, but unable to keep the words inside. "I want it to mean this wasn't just one night. I want it to mean we're trying something real here, something worth fighting for, even if it's complicated, even if it's hard." He paused, searching her eyes for some sign of rejection, of fear, of regret. But all he saw was hope, fragile, frightened, but undeniably there. I want you to meet Lily, he continued, his voice trembling slightly. I want you to be part of my life, our life, not as my boss, not as a secret affair, but as someone who matters, someone I want by my side. The tears Madeline had been holding back finally fell, sliding down her cheeks in silent trails. She covered her mouth with one hand, as if trying to contain the emotion threatening to overflow. Ethan, she whispered through her fingers, are you sure? Because I don't know how to be that, don't know how to be the person someone wants by their side, don't know if I'll be good enough for you, for Lily. Ethan took the hand covering her mouth and gently moved it away, intertwining their fingers. You're already good enough, he said firmly. You just can't see it yet. But I see it, and I want to show you. Madeline sobbed, throwing herself into his arms again. Ethan held her tight, feeling her tremble against him as years of insecurity and loneliness finally found an outlet. When she finally calmed down, she pulled back enough to look into his eyes, and there was a determination there that wasn't there before. I want this too, she said, each word loaded with conviction. I want to try. I want to be part of your life, of Lily's life. But Ethan, she hesitated, biting her lip. I need you to know I'm going to mess up sometimes. I'm going to be difficult. I'm going to be scared, and I'll probably try to hide behind my defenses when things get too real. I know, Ethan said with a gentle smile, and that's okay. Because I'm going to mess up too. I'm going to be overprotective. I'm going to worry too much. I'm going to have days when I can barely keep it all together. Madeline laughed through the tears. What a pair we are. The perfect pair, Ethan corrected, kissing her forehead. Imperfect, but perfect for each other. She smiled, a smile so radiant, so full of hope and possibility, that Ethan felt as if the sun had risen inside his chest. I have to confess something, Madeline said suddenly, hesitation in her voice. What? She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. I don't want to pretend anymore that I can do everything alone. I don't want to keep living as if I don't need anyone, as if asking for help is weakness. Her hands squeezed his. I want you by my side, Ethan, not as an employee, not as a distraction, as a man, as a partner, as someone I can trust to catch me when I fall. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and promise. Ethan felt something expand in his chest, something warm and powerful that he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten the name. Hope. He pulled her into another kiss, this one slow and deep, sealing the promise they'd just made to each other. When they separated, both were smiling, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem scary. It seemed possible. I need to go, Ethan finally said, visible reluctance in every syllable. But I'll call you later. And maybe tomorrow night we could have dinner together again, the three of us. Madeline's eyes widened, a mixture of excitement and terror crossing her face. You want me to meet Lily this soon? There's no right timeline for this, Ethan replied. But I know I want you two to meet, and I know Lily will love you as much as I... He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd almost said. Madeline froze, her eyes wide. As much as you... Ethan swallowed hard. It was too soon to say that. They barely knew each other outside the professional context, but looking at her now, vulnerable and beautiful and completely his, he couldn't lie. As much as I'm starting to love, he finished softly. The silence that followed was deafening. Madeline stared at him, tears welling up in her eyes again, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Then, in a whisper so low he almost didn't hear it, she said, Me too. I'm starting to, too. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Ethan could see it in her eyes, could feel it in the way she clung to him, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become wonderfully uncertain. They kissed one more time, long and deep, memorizing the taste of each other. Then, with visible reluctance, Ethan got up and began to dress. Madeline watched him from where she sat on the bed, the sheet wrapped around her body, a soft smile on her lips. When he was fully dressed, he leaned over the bed for one last kiss. See you later, he murmured against her lips. See you later, she echoed, and there was a promise in those words that made Ethan's heart sing. He walked to the door but stopped in the doorway, turning to look at her one more time. And in that moment, with the morning light illuminating her face and that genuine smile on her lips, Ethan knew, with a certainty that both frightened and moved him in equal measure, that Madeleine Stone wasn't just a passing passion. She was the beginning of something real, something lasting, something worth every risk, every complication, every challenge that would come their way. And he couldn't wait to discover where this journey would take them. The week following that transformative night was a constant exercise in balance. At the office, Ethan and Madeleine maintained a careful professional distance. Formal meetings, courteous emails, nothing that could raise suspicions. But the looks they exchanged across conference rooms, the secret smiles when no one was watching, the way their fingers accidentally brushed when passing documents, all of it carried the weight of a silent promise. At night, though, it was different. They talked for hours on the phone, their voices becoming the most comforting sound to each other. Madeleine told him about difficult meetings and stressful business decisions, and Ethan shared stories about Lily, her achievements at school, her impossible-to-answer questions, the way she asked when she'd meet Daddy's special friend. Because Ethan had told her, not all the details, but enough. He'd said he'd met someone special, someone who made him smile in a way she hadn't seen in a long time. And Lily, with the peculiar wisdom of children, had simply smiled and said, "Then she must be really nice." Now, as Ethan tidied the house for the third time that afternoon, checking if everything was perfect, his stomach churned with nervousness. Madeleine was coming to dinner. She'd meet Lily. It would be the first time the three of them would be together, and the weight of that moment felt overwhelming. "Dad, you already cleaned the table twice," Lily observed from the living room, where she sat on the couch with a book. She looked at him with that perceptive expression that always surprised him. "Are you nervous?" Ethan stopped, dish towel in hand, and smiled at his daughter. "A little," he admitted. "It's important to me that you two get along." Lily closed her book and stood up, walking over to him. Even being smaller, there was a maturity in her eyes that sometimes made Ethan forget she was still a child. She hugged his waist, pressing her face against his chest. "If she makes you happy, I already like her," she said simply. Ethan felt his eyes sting. He hugged his daughter back, kissing the top of her head. "When did you get so wise?" "Always have been," Lily replied with a mischievous smile. "You're just noticing now." The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, and Ethan felt his heart race. He looked at Lily, who gave him an encouraging smile, and then went to the door, nervously smoothing his shirt. When he opened it, Madeleine was there, and Ethan had to hold his breath. She wasn't wearing one of her impeccable suits or elegant dresses. Instead, she wore dark jeans, a simple, light-colored blouse, and a comfortable cardigan. Her hair was loose with just a light touch of makeup, and in her hands she held a box of sweets and a colorful package. But what caught Ethan's attention most was the expression on her face, a mixture of hope, nervousness, and something that looked dangerously close to fear. She was as vulnerable in that moment as she'd been that first night in the parking lot. "Hi," she said softly, a shy smile touching her lips. "Hi," Ethan replied, opening the door wider. "Come in." Madeleine entered, her eyes immediately searching for and finding Lily, who watched from the living room entrance. For a moment, the two just looked at each other, the woman who was learning to open her heart and the child who had the power to break it or heal it. Then Lily smiled, that open and genuine smile she'd inherited from Ethan, and walked toward Madeleine. "You must be Madeleine," she said, with a confidence that made Ethan smile. "My dad talked a lot about you." Madeleine knelt down to be at Lily's height, and Ethan saw her hands tremble slightly as she extended the colorful package. "And he talked a lot about you, too. I brought you a present. I hope you like it." Lily took the package with eyes bright with curiosity. When she opened it, it revealed a book, not just any book, but a first edition of Alice in Wonderland, with beautiful illustrations and carefully preserved pages. "Wow," Lily whispered, her fingers tracing the cover with reverence. "It's beautiful." "Your dad told me you love to read," Madeleine explained, and there was an anxiety in her voice that revealed how much she wanted this to work. "And Alice was always one of my favorites when I was young. I thought maybe you'd like it too." Lily looked at the book, then at Madeleine, and then did something no one expected. She threw herself into Madeleine's arms in a tight hug. "Thank you," she murmured against Madeleine's shoulder. It's the best present I've ever gotten." Ethan saw the exact moment when Madeline broke. Her eyes filled with tears as she returned the hug, her hands trembling as she held this child she'd just met, but who already meant so much because she was part of Ethan. When they finally separated, Madeline quickly wiped away the tears, smiling through them. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Dinner was surprisingly easy. Ethan had prepared lasagna, nothing fancy but made with love, and they sat at the small kitchen table, talking and laughing in a way that felt so natural, it was hard to believe it was the first time they were together like this. Lily told stories about school, showing a talent for storytelling that made Madeline truly laugh, not the polite and measured laugh she used at corporate events, but a genuine laugh that lit up her entire face. Madeline, in turn, shared stories from her own childhood, things she'd never told anyone, memories she'd kept for so long she'd forgotten they were precious. And Ethan just watched, his heart expanding with each interaction, each shared smile, each moment of connection between the two most important people in his life. After dinner, Lily asked if they could go out to the porch to watch the stars. The night was clear, rare for the city, and the sky was dotted with bright points that competed with the urban lights. Ethan brought blankets, and the three settled in, Lily between him and Madeline, pointing at constellations and making up stories about them. At some point, Lily's head began to grow heavy and she leaned against Madeline, her eyes slowly closing. Madeline froze for a moment, clearly unsure what to do. Then, slowly, carefully, she put her arm around Lily's shoulders, letting the child snuggle against her. Ethan looked at them, his daughter asleep in Madeline's arms, Madeline's face soft and full of a tenderness he'd never seen before, and felt something settle definitively in his chest. This was real, this was right, this was exactly where they should be. "She loves you," Madeline whispered, looking down at Lily with an expression of wonder. "She trusts you," Ethan corrected gently. "And for Lily, that's even more important." Madeline looked up to meet his eyes, and in the soft starlight Ethan could see tears shining there again. "I never thought I'd have this," she confessed, her voice broken. "A family. People who want me not for what I can do for them, but just for who I am." Ethan reached out and intertwined his fingers with hers, the simple touch carrying the weight of all the promises they'd made to each other. "You have it now," he said firmly. "We want you. I want you. Not as my boss, not as a passing affair, as part of my life, as part of our life." A tear slid down Madeline's cheek, but she smiled through it. "I want this too," she whispered. "More than anything I've ever wanted in my life." They stayed like that for long minutes, just holding hands across the space where Lily slept peacefully, watching the stars and feeling, for the first time in a long time, that they belonged somewhere, to someone. Eventually, Ethan carefully carried Lily inside, putting her to bed and softly kissing her forehead. When he returned to the living room, he found Madeline standing near the door, looking at the pictures on the wall. Photos of Lily growing up, of happy moments captured over the years. "You built something beautiful here," she said when she heard him approach. "A home, a life, something real and precious." Ethan positioned himself behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "And now you're part of it," he murmured against her hair. "If you want to be." Madeline turned in his arms, her hands rising to hold his face. "I do," she said, and there was a certainty in her voice that wasn't there before. "I want to be part of this. I want to wake up knowing I'm not alone. I want to have dinner with you both. I want to hear Lily's stories. I want to build a life with you, Ethan. A real life." Ethan felt his heart explode with joy. He pulled her into a kiss, deep, slow, full of all the emotions words couldn't express. And when they separated, both were smiling, tears of happiness shining in their eyes. "Then let's do this," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "Let's build this together, day by day, one step at a time." "Together," Madeline echoed, and that word, simple but loaded with meaning, seemed to seal their fate. She stayed a while longer, and they sat on the couch intertwined with each other, talking about the future with a hope neither of them had felt in years. They talked about how they'd navigate the situation at the office, about how they'd gradually introduce Madeline into Lily's life, about all the challenges that would come, but they also talked about possibilities, about weekends together, about family vacations, about building something lasting and real. When Madeline finally got up to leave, Ethan walked her to the door. Before she could go, he pulled her back for one last hug, holding her tight, as if wanting to memorize that moment. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "For letting me in, for trusting me, for giving us a chance." Madeline pulled back enough to look into his eyes, and what he saw there took his breath away. There was love, still new, still frightening, but undeniably there. "Thank you," she replied, "for showing me I deserve to be loved, that I don't need to be perfect to be enough, that I can just be myself." They kissed one more time, and this time it was different from all the other kisses they'd shared. It wasn't full of desperate desire or urgent need. It was soft, tender, full of promises and hope for the future. When Madeline finally left, Ethan stood at the door watching her get in the car and drive away. And even after she disappeared into the night, he stayed there, a permanent smile on his face. For the first time in years, the future didn't seem scary or empty. It seemed full of possibilities, full of hope, full of love. He gently closed the door and walked to Lily's room, peeking through the partially open door. She slept peacefully, the book Madeline had given her resting on the nightstand beside her. And in that moment, with his heart overflowing, Ethan knew it had all been worth it. All the lonely nights, all the fears, all the struggles, everything had led to this moment, to this possibility, to this love. Because sometimes, when we least expect it, life gives us exactly what we didn't dare to wish for. And when that happens, all we can do is open our arms, open our hearts, and let it in. And that's exactly what Ethan, Madeline, and Lily were doing, together, as a family, not perfect, but real. And that was more than enough. It was everything. Sometimes all a weary soul needs is to be seen, truly seen. Ethan and Madeline found exactly that in each other, someone who saw beyond the masks, beyond the armor. He saw the woman behind the ice. She saw the man who didn't fear her vulnerability. And together, with Lily between them, they discovered that family isn't just blood. It's choice. It's presence. It's the embrace that says you don't need to be perfect to be loved. Maybe true courage isn't in never falling, but in allowing someone to catch you when you do. And maybe, deep down, this story is also about us. Do we also deserve to be seen? Do we also deserve a love that doesn't demand perfection, just truth? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and become a member for early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, click the super thanks button too. Your support makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories that move you. Comment below where you're listening from. We'd love to know where this story reached you.